Welcome back. The demands on the Chancellor's purse are many. Housing, the NHS, education, plus, of course, calls for a Brexit no-deal contingency fund. Stephen Hammond sits on the Treasury Select Committee as a former government minister and can now add Brexit mutineer to his list of titles. Mr Hammond, very good morning to you.
Niall, good morning to you.
What do you think we need to see from Philip Hammond this week in terms of the budget? I mean, it's pretty clear he's not necessarily the most popular man in politics at the moment.
Well, I don't think there are many people who are universally popular in politics, as I've proved this week, as you've just mentioned. But I think that Philip's actually very well and highly regarded by almost all my colleagues on the basis that I think that we recognise him a man who's in charge of the economy, who knows what he's doing. As to what we're going to see this week, I think we're going to see a mixture of two things. I think we're going to see him still talk about an economy that's strong and is likely to get stronger next year as inflation starts to recede. And I think he's also going to say, well, look, we've almost sort of paid our way out of Labour's financial mess. It'd be stupid to give that up now. But I did it prudently in my last budget, create 26 billion of headroom. Some of that will have to go on Brexit, some of it will go on housing, and some of it will go on the NHS. I think basically Philip's been in listening mode, and you're going to see a movement from fiscal Phil to hopeful Hammond.
But it does seem that he has not a huge amount of room for manoeuvre, and that lack of room seems to be self-imposed. I mean, he doesn't necessarily, it doesn't appear to want to raise taxes. He's ideologically opposed to that. He doesn't want to take advantage of interest rates and borrow on top of what we're already borrowing, despite interest rates being where they are.
Well, if we borrowed it, we'd still be putting another load of debt on the next generation. And at a time when in 2 years' time, we'd like to start paying down debt. And we're talking a little bit about intergenerational issues at the moment, and some of that will come up in this budget. Why would you do the worst thing for the next generation by loading more debt on them? I think what he's going to be looking at is some of the money he's put aside in the headroom, but also there are other policies he can do to bring land forward more quickly, and I think he'll be looking at that. I think he'll be saying that he should be spending some of that 26 billion, and I think you'll see some of that on nursing pay. The Brexit, I think you'll see some on maybe intergenerational issues in terms of helping out students, and certainly quite a bit of it on housing.
Let's stick on housing for just a moment. And do we think that the Chancellor might put aside his ideological objections to borrowing in terms of local authorities, essentially freeing them up to borrow so long as that money's being used to build?
Well, I think last year you saw quite a big movement for local authorities, housing associations, which a lot of local authorities do their housing through at the moment, were given some major changes last year that were helpful. I think Philip will look at that quite carefully. I think it's clearly one of the ways of moving forward. Also, making sure that local authorities are bringing forward land that isn't being used. In London, one of the problems is the Mayor seems to have put a complete block on the London Land Commission working. So a lot of excess public sector land that could be brought forward more quickly isn't being done so. But
we are unlikely to see any movement on building on Greenbelt, though.
Well, you've got to remember, although the Chancellor has a constituency which is sort of only 8 miles from Greater London, basically most of his constituency is Greenbelt. But there's plenty of other land we could use before we start need to be concreting over the Greenbelt. There is, as I've said, a huge amount of excess public sector land. There's brownfield sites. There are some infill sites in villages that could be redesignated. But the idea of he's going to build all over the Greenbelt, I think is highly unlikely.
As you mentioned, it does also seem likely that we're going to see some movement on health spending. But isn't it the simple truth that no matter what the Chancellor offers in terms of increased funding for the NHS, it just will never be enough?
Well, I think we have a fantastic NHS with marvellously committed professionals, doctors, nurses. I think what the Chancellor may well be saying to the NHS is, every time you ask for more money, we've put it in. They asked for 8 billion. George Osborne put that in 2 years ago. They're asking for more money now, and I'm sure there'll be some. I think the Chancellor may well be saying to Simon Stevens, first of all, stop using bogus figures, and secondly, make sure your own house is in order in some of your administrative departments, which appear to be less efficient and less good than our doctors and nurses.
Let's turn our attention again to Brexit and the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. Your colleague Charlie Elphicke reiterated his plea this week for an extra £1 billion to be set aside to prepare Dover and the surrounding area for the prospect of no deal. I mean, we have to start spending money right now, don't we? I mean, David Davis told me he spends so much of his time considering other options, but we need to have the money set aside right now to start that infrastructural spend.
Well, we set that quite prudently and sensibly, as I mentioned a moment ago. The Chancellor set some money aside last year for headroom. He explicitly said some of that would be for Brexit preparations, whether we have a deal or no deal, we're going to have to spend some money. And I think we should all be working forward to getting a deal. Actually, crashing out with a no deal will be an economic catastrophe for this country. But what we really do need to do is to spend some of that money. And the Chancellor has already said he's already spent some of that. He's already said that some of that headroom will be for Brexit, and I'm convinced that he'll spend some of that prudently as we go forward.
Of course, as I mentioned, you were rather famously described this week as a Brexit mutineer. Now, I'm sure that both of us have been called far worse at various points, but what did you make of that?
I thought it was a pretty silly headline from a newspaper that has form on this. I've never voted against my party in my life. We're going through a normal part of the bill process, which is to try and amend it to make the bill better in committee. I have some strongly held views on certain things. I'm trying to persuade the government that they should look at our amendments, and I'm hopeful that at the end of it, the government will accept a number of those amendments. But as I say, there was a sort of a smile in my life when I've been called a mutineer, having been a loyal member of the Conservative Party for 30 years. To be called a mutineer was quite odd.
But let's just deal with the meat of the argument. I mean, why shouldn't the date of our exit from the European Union essentially be enshrined in law? Why shouldn't those who actually voted for Brexit have that decision that they took protected in statute?
Well, it's protected anyway by the Article 50 agreement. The point we are making is that... hold on, let me finish. The whole point is that the Article 50 process does allow by the EU 28 to have a limited flexibility at the end if negotiations need to continue. Why would you, in British law, when you're trying to get through negotiations, which may now be longer than we at first hoped for, if they were run up to the end, all our other partners say, right, we'll extend these negotiations by maybe a couple of weeks, and we have to say, well, we put a date in law, so we can't do it. It is madness to do that. And secondly, the government has said it wants flexibility in negotiation. The very last thing this does is put flexibility in negotiation. It allows the EU 27 to come back and say to us, we know if you want a deal, you're going to have to agree by that date. It's taken all the government's flexibility away. There's no need to do it because the essential provision is already there. This is layering an unnecessary hindrance on the government, which simply it doesn't need to do.
So in terms of a no-deal Brexit, what is your assessment of how likely an outcome that might be? It seems that it's moved from being something of a distant prospect to a distinct reality.
Well, I think we have to make provision for it, and we have to accept it's a possibility. And we have to accept, actually, by putting this date on the face of the bill, unfortunately, you've made that more likely. I want to see a deal that we can continue to trade with our European partners in much the same way as we have now, but with some of the opportunities that are around by leaving the European Union. Personally, as you know, I voted Remain, but I accept we're going to leave. But the last thing is that, as I said a moment ago, crashing out with no deal will be disastrous for this country. We'll see a hit to GDP, a hit to people's incomes, and a hit to jobs. Why would you want to do that when there is a chance of getting a deal that will stop all of that?
Some of your colleagues were previously pretty opposed to any transition period after the point at which we came out formally of the European Union. There seems to be a general acceptance of the need of a period of transition now. But do you envisage a period of transition lasting, as the Irish Foreign Minister suggests, perhaps as long as 5 years?
Well, I think we've got to be clear about what the transition period is. The transition period is two things. One, it's the how we get out and the period of getting out and the setting in place the medium-term arrangements. The arrangements for trade will probably take longer than the 2 years, and pretty much everybody accepts that. I think a 2-year transitional period will provide certainty to British industry, and I think that's key, and therefore making sure that we have a transitional period agreed, and that is agreed as fast as possible so that major companies who have huge numbers of jobs in this country know what the arrangements are for when we leave will be very helpful.
One of those Cabinet colleagues who seemed to be previously opposed to any period of transition but has changed his position is of course, Boris Johnson. I mean, do you ever sit alone at night by the fire with your head in your hands, reading reports of what Boris Johnson has been up to this week and think, Boris, why?
Well, I had always hoped that I would have persuaded, along with a number of colleagues, that Boris should vote Remain. He chose not to. I worked very closely with Boris as a Mayor of London. I think he was an excellent Mayor of London. Obviously, I disagree with him over the EU, but I think he's doing a good job as Foreign Secretary. My job, I'm afraid, is to be a Conservative Member of Parliament trying to push what I believe in was best for my constituents. And also, the other thing, you know, I make a complete rule never to be rude about my colleagues.
Is he unsackable?
I make a complete rule never to be rude about my colleagues. Boris is doing a good job as Foreign Secretary.
Stephen Hammond, many thanks for being with us.
Thank you.